government to the achievement of a just society. And I'm quite sure that that's an ideal for which we strive on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I shan't keep you much longer, but I just want to finish briefly by talking for a moment about corruption, and then putting to you an assertion and a question. I must say something about corruption because I think it would be evasive and cowardly not to do so. Moreover, I think that truth is always better out in the open. Let's not mince words about this. The very nature of police work, involving discretion in the exercise of control over people, inevitably involves a risk of corruption. It must do in any society. So far as the uniformed police in Britain are concerned, that's the overwhelming majority. That's been virtually eliminated by changing social attitudes and more sensible legislation. I don't think for one moment that Parliament intended this, but it is a coincidental benefit which their legislation brought about. Liquor licensing, street betting, by that I mean the legalization of betting shops and therefore the disappearance of street betting. Gaming, which is now controlled by a gaming board. Prostitution, sexual deviance, about which we are now infinitely more tolerant. These no longer pose any serious problems in the area of police corruption. Even parking control, which was a kind of routine nuisance, has now been handed over to civilian auxiliaries. I'm not being a bit complacent when I say that for a quarter of a century now, the standard of probity of the British police has been very high, but the detective remains much more open to temptation. Dissatisfaction with the trial process, about which he's often too frightened to speak publicly. The high profits of criminals and their lawyers, and their too frequent immunity from the criminal law. These and other factors continually tempt detectives to say, if they can get away with it, why can't I? Now, the problem has been particularly acute in London, where for years, in fact, ever since 1879, allegations of corruption by detectives were investigated by their own colleagues. All that, I'm glad to tell you, in brief, has been changed. Nobody would attempt in their right mind to suggest that detectives don't or won't do wrong, but it is now possible to tell you with certainty that changes in selection, promotion, and discipline procedure ensure that if that wrongdoing is brought to notice either by a criminal or by any other complainant, it is absolutely certain of swift, impartial, and ruthless correction. The corrective process has been very painful. I once described it to a kind of English Ed Murrow as cutting out the cancer without killing the patient, and it involved the premature departure of 478 policemen during my 5 years as Commissioner, as compared with 16 a year in the previous decade. But the effect on public opinion has been simply immeasurable, not least because of the much greater effectiveness of the force in dealing with crime. We've laid once and for all the absurd bogey, the belief that you must set a thief to catch a thief. On the contrary, the most effective answer to crime is an honest police force. Now, I propose to put this question and assertion to you because I think it's equally relevant in both our countries. It doesn't lie within the power of the police to improve their results. Only you can do that. And you won't achieve it by spending more money on the police and their equipment. Welcome and necessary, though that may well be in certain areas. But only by careful, continuing research and impartial review of the criminal law. You must make up your minds what it is you really want. Absolute unrestricted freedom for the individual, with all that this implies: freedom to rob, freedom to steal, freedom to break into shops and houses, freedom to intimidate minorities by threats and violence. Don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this is the price that your society and mine will pay for the continued enjoyment of liberty without responsibility. You can compensate the victim of criminal violence. You can provide free medical care for those who suffer it. You can encourage crime prevention and insurance to lessen the hardship arising from crime. But you will not reduce crime until you recognize that it is no longer enough for every citizen, including those suspected or charged with crime, to play a negative part in the enforcement of the criminal law. The surest and the quickest way to reduce crime and to achieve a more humane and enlightened penal system in both our countries is to increase the likelihood that wrongdoers will be caught, and even more important, that the guilty will be convicted. If you are not willing to do this, you cannot hope to achieve any real progress in reducing crime or in changing society's object in dealing with criminals. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not for the police, it is for you to decide. Now, having wearied you, I fear, or cowed you to the point of submission, I'm now quite happy to answer any questions that you may wish to put to me about anything that I have said, or indeed any other aspect of policing in which you may feel that I can be of assistance to you. But before I do let me make one comment. I find from sad experience at this stage in the evening that audiences and their speaker are rather like the youthful swain who is saying good night to the rather pretty girl at the doorstep of her parents' home. He's rather frightened of bidding her good night in case she takes offense and won't see him again. And she's rather frightened of saying good night in case he doesn't come back. Well, let's have none of that. You've been an extremely kind and attentive audience, and whilst I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may wish to put to me, the last thing I would wish to do after your courtesy and kindness is to offend by keeping any one of you here longer than he or she really wishes to stay. And I really do mean that quite sincerely. So if anybody would like to fire at me, I'm entirely at your disposal. But if you do feel that you wish to leave, or you have a girlfriend who's anxiously pounding on the pavement outside, don't let me keep you. Yes. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand to ask a question. Yes.
Early in your lecture this evening, you said that few of us really had any understanding of the criminal, what he was actually like. That the media, for instance, represented the criminal, the legal offender. Could you tell us, from your perception, what the legal offender is like?
Well, I think the whole point about what I call fictional presentation of crime is that it doesn't intentionally mislead, but of course it always stops, if you think about it, or almost always stops at the point of arrest. You get exceptional films like that one with Henry Fonda about the jury, but broadly speaking, I think as a generalization, about 99% of the cops and robbers serials on television, or even the stories on the cinematograph screen, are usually the planning or the commission of a crime, followed by the police investigation and the result. It never goes into the actuality of crime, because, you know, the problems of the police don't even start until the arrest has been carried out. That is, in fact, where the difficulties begin. Now, the more you persuade through the crime novel, the television screen and the cinema screen, the more you persuade people that the system works well, the more difficulties you face. On the one hand, you have the advantage that you're persuading quite a broad spectrum of people that it does work, and therefore it may dissuade them from committing crime. On the other hand, you're also persuading people that it works better than it really does, so that when in fact you find the police misbehaving or the system of justice failing after the point of arrest, people don't understand it and wonder why. That is, in my country, why police misbehavior is so heavily frowned upon, because police feel that the system of justice is more effective than it is. Don't think I'm a hard-nosed cop saying this. One of our greatest judges of this century, of whom you may have heard, Lord Devlin, Patrick Devlin, said in a book called The Criminal Prosecution in England, only a few years ago, that if the English system of criminal justice is to be judged by the number of criminals whom it convicts and punishes, then it is an undoubted failure. And he is, without question, a most liberal judge. I must say, in my 17 days, and this is my 5th visit to the state, I can't help being profoundly impressed by the good manners of my American hosts. There are times, however, when I think they almost carry good manners too far. At this point in England, almost certainly one would feel the odd bullet whistling past one's ears. Yes. You raise a... Well, you do raise a very interesting point. You're quite right. White-collar crime, by which I expect you mean fraud, forgery, bank frauds, there's no question about it that as we become more proficient at dealing with the conventional forms of crime, there's no doubt about it that more and more people are committing that kind of crime. The paradox is that crime of that kind is normally, in some ways, easier to detect successfully than the conventional forms of crime. But the trouble is that the resources that it requires and the time that it takes are very often self-defeating, so that we don't achieve the degree of success in dealing with it that we should. And there's no doubt about it that with the growth of the European community, I think the complexity of white-collar crime is likely to grow quite considerably in Europe. I've no doubt that you have the same problem interstate. I think we're going to get it into country too. I think it's, if I may say so, I think it's a very prescient question. Yes?
Do you have a comment to the study by Baldwin and McConville reported in the Washington Post, a study of claiming that the British judicial system is systematically unfair to defendants?
I know Messrs. Baldwin and McConville. They are members of the Institute of Judicial Administration of the University of Birmingham, and they are presently engaged in an extensive research study into trial by jury. And I, in fact, begged them to extend their study to the Metropolitan Police District, because I believe that the problem of misbehavior, both by lawyers in particular, and by the criminals, is particularly difficult. And they agreed to do this. In fact, I went so far as to offer them all the clerical and administrative help that they may need without any charge, provided that they would do all the brain work and produce a totally impartial study. The point was, you see, I wasn't trying to get them to prove anything I wanted. All I wanted was an impartial examination of jury trials in London. Now, the book that they have published is only a first step in this very considerable research they're undertaking. And I'm very sorry that the bar, I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, whether you understand our legal system, but it's divided into what we call solicitors and the bar. The difference is that a solicitor only has a right of audience in a lower court. He may not appear as an advocate in a trial by jury. That is done by what we call a barrister. And it is the solicitor who instructs the barrister, who may appear one day for the prosecution and the following day for the defense. There's no question in England of them simply being confined to the one task. The bar, I was very sorry that the bar declined to take part. in that research by those two gentlemen, and the Law Society, of course, repudiated it once they realized the way the findings were going to go. I have absolutely no doubt in their integrity. I think that both parts of the legal profession are being really rather unnecessarily sensitive about it. I think that if they were a little bit more open and were prepared to admit that members of all professions can make errors of judgment or can do wrong, that they would not perhaps have drawn quite the attention to the book that was drawn. I don't know whether you know, I think you probably do, that in fact the Vice-Chancellor of Birmingham University was so concerned about the attitude of the Bar Council and the Law Society that he took the exceptional course of writing a foreword to the book in which he offered his impartial and learned opinion that it was a perfectly respectable piece of research. This doesn't mean to say that plea bargaining in England, I don't think the book implies that plea bargaining has anything like the same dimensions that it has here. Because if I understand your lawyers correctly, the basis of plea bargaining here is the impossibility, so they say, of dealing in your courts with the burden of criminal business. Now, whatever plea bargaining takes place in Britain is on a very much smaller scale and has nothing whatever to do with the amount of work before the courts. It is almost always arising from considerations which both prosecution and defence, in conjunction with the judge, think proper to consider both in the public interest and the interest of the defendant. Did you have some serious reservations about the book?
No, it's just a report in the Washington Post.
Yes. I think if you read the book, you would be surprised. It's not a, how shall I put it? It isn't a sort of fire-raising book at all. It's a very moderate and quite learned book. I think that the lawyers have tended to bring a certain amount of attention to it because of their reaction to it. If they'd been a little bit more moderate in their reaction, I don't think, quite honestly, it would have got the attention that it did get. But it isn't comparable with the American situation at all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we really have got to the stage where I can see that the rather attractive young lady wishes to close the door without giving offence. I would like to say to you once more that I did say to you that I wasn't going to talk about cops and robbers. I could have told you all sorts of really quite exciting tales about the siege of Spaghetti House, where we had 6 Italians held hostage by 3 gunmen for 3 days with 150 cameras and the world's press looking on, where we had 4 gunmen in a flat in Balcombe Street with an elderly man and woman for 6 days, and again with the world's press looking on. I could tell you the almost unbelievable story to demonstrate our new relationship with the press of the kidnapping of a Greek Cypriot girl, 17 years old, last winter, when we called in the 37 editors of the fiercely competitive London press and asked them, we couldn't compel them, we asked them not to print the story until they'd given us a chance to pay the ransom and recover the girl. And believe it or not, those 37 editors of one of the largest centres of the press in the world didn't print a word for 11 days. We paid the ransom, we got the girl back alive, we got the ransom money back alive, and we arrested all the kidnappers. If that isn't evidence of the fact that there can be a good, trusting relationship between the public and the police, frankly, I don't know what is. May I say, finally, that I'm very grateful to you. You may think it's a long way to come to talk to you, but I must say I find it very rewarding, not least because of the closeness of your attention to what is admittedly a somewhat ponderous theme, but a theme which I think much more worthwhile explaining to you than simply telling you the ups and downs of everyday crime in London. I'm very grateful for your attention.
Thank you very much.